Hi, folks. Okay, then. Well, I've got this episode 3 of this marathon journey through racing and rock and roll. In the last episode, I was talking about the first test I went on with Goodyear down to Silverstone with the F1. It was basically as I say, the first time I'd ever really been around any Formula One cars or racing cars of any description, and to see these things and hear them and hear the engines and all the rest of it was, it was certainly something different. And this particular test, there were all the major teams that were there. There was, Williams, Lotus, McLaren. Ferrari, everybody like that. It was the normal British Grand Prix test, and one of the sort of things I really do remember about it was the Williams team owner, Frank Williams, had a horrendous car accident, which basically put him in a wheelchair from that day. I think he had an accident rushing away from the Paul Ricard circuit in south of France, and it put him into hospital, and he's been in a wheelchair ever since that day. But anyway, this was the first time that Frank had turned up at the circuit since the accident, and I remember him being wheeled out into the pit lane in his wheelchair. And Nelson Piquet and Nigel Mansell hadn't seen him, from the day of the accident or before the accident until this particular day. So Frank was wheeled into the pit lane, and he looked, he looked awful, to be honest with you. I mean, he sort of improved his physical well-being in later years and that as much as he could do, but the guy looked in a poor way. But he was there. It was his team. His name was above the door, and he was there to see his guys going round. One of the other memorable things about that one was that Nigel Mansell had come down in his helicopter, and there was some kind of a call from somewhere at lunchtime, and there'd been a big accident on the motorway, and they were trying to get somebody to sort of do some kind of rapid response thing. Well, Nigel broke off from the test session and essentially got in his helicopter and flew over to the wherever the motorway was, at the M1, or I don't know if the M40 was even built then. But he helped out, and he actually helped transfer this patient from this accident over to the hospital. So anyway, he came back and carried on the test session in the afternoon, which I thought, okay, the day in the life of an F1 driver. But what I found was that it was a big sort of learning curve for me, basically to start fitting these F1 tyres, because I don't think I'd realised how damn big the things were, and we didn't used to have automatic fitting machines and everything in those days. It was all done by hand, and the sort of equipment that we had was very, very rudimentary and basic. If you look at, if you go into a quick fit or something now, you'll see these big tyre fitting machines and that. Well, what we used to do was we had, and this is sort of like a music analogy, we had a thing called what we called the Iron Maiden, and it was essentially a metal table with a big pole in it, and you threw the Formula One tyres on the top of this, and you had to break them down with a manual bead breaker. It was hard work. And especially some of the rear tyres, which are 18 inches wide. I mean, I'm a pretty short fella, and I found it a bit of a struggle to get into, over the top of these things and breaking the tyres down. And but we did it, But we had to. I can't remember what we would have fitted on that tyre test, but we used to do. We'd fit up 400 a day, something like that, and you'd have two guys working on the fitting tables, and essentially you'd be, they'd get the tyres out of the truck, feed them over to you. The wheelmen from each team, they'd bring over the wheels, and you'd work all day fitting these tyres. And Goodyear at the time used to carry probably 5 compounds of tyres, which you got A's, B's, C, D's and E's. A's being the hardest compound, and E's being what was essentially the softest compound, which was a qualifying tyre. And the actual construction of these tyres used to vary from race to race, but your tyre would be designated for that particular circuit as the E compound. Now, some of these, the cars back in those days were running sort of 1.5 litre V6 turbo engines, and some of these cars were developing anything up to 1,1400 horsepower in qualifying trim. So essentially, all the tyres were they would get blistered so quickly because of the power that was going through the rear wheels. And we used to, when I started there, we were filling them up with normal. You get your compressor and you fill them with air. But then we started using nitrogen, because essentially what that does, in normal air compressors, you get water vapor, and what used to happen was you get little drops of water getting into the tires, and when they get up to the high temperatures, that water used to boil, and then what would happen is that would cause blisters on the tires as well. And in some of the qualifying runs that the cars did, on a set of qualifying tyres, the E's, the soft ones, you would get one out lap from them, one hot lap and one in lap. And the state of these tyres when they came back, I mean, they were basically blistered and pretty well all down to the carcasses. And that was essentially down to the power of the cars. That was, it was incredible. So yeah, I mean, we used to fit, as I say, probably 400 of these every day. But then that was that sort of session done with. And I thought, yeah, okay, I've done a test session. I've enjoyed it. I've been around the racing and that. So I wasn't sure whether I was going to stay on with Goodyear, whether they wanted me to. But before I knew it, I was given an itinerary, and I was off to the French Grand Prix, which was the first race I'd ever done. So at the time, I hadn't got a Class 1 HGV licence, where most of the other guys had. I mean, see, with most of the Goodyear fellas, they came out of the factory, or they'd been essentially like general haulage drivers, and then they would come and do a spell on the race team. And some of the guys were, I think we had about half a dozen who were permanent race team members, and some of the other guys came in on a season-long basis or as temps, and I was one of those temps. But because I hadn't got a Class 1 licence, I was with 2 or 3 other guys, and we were driving in the minibus. So, yeah, I mean, as I say, we got our marching orders, and I was off to the French Grand Prix. So, yeah, we headed off in the minibus, get down to the ferry, get over to Calais, and then off we go. But one of the funny things was, because we followed the trucks down there, but we actually stopped in this hotel, and we all set off the next day, and you'd have 2 drivers in each truck and what have you, and they would you'd generally swap around and that. But one of the lads actually chucked his luggage in the trailer of another truck, and he got in the cab with somebody else. They got split up, and the one truck was maybe he'd gone half an hour down the road or something like that. Well, one of these lads, he hadn't got his luggage, and he'd had some iffy food the night before. Anyway, unfortunately, he had a bit of an accident, but he'd got no clothes to change into, and so he had to sit in the cab in a bit of a mess with one of the other drivers. And it wasn't until later that evening that he was able to meet up with the other truck, because there was no mobile phones back then, so we couldn't sort of say to somebody, oh, we need the bag out the back. He'd got to wait all day in a bit of an embarrassing situation. But we got down to the hotel. He sorted himself out. We all had a damn good laugh about it, as you would when it doesn't happen to you. And and then probably went and had a few drinks, did what we did, and then headed off the next day to the French Grand Prix. And I'll give a little bit of an insight on that in the next episode.